Alright, so today I want to show you what I consider to be some of the best Axanthic combinations in ball pythons. And Axanthic is actually a recessive mutation. You need 2 copies of the Axanthic for a visual. And essentially what Axanthic does is it strips all the color from the snake, and you're left with the black and white and silver ball pythons. And it's kind of interesting if you mix certain genes in with the Axanthic, sometimes it can have pretty unexpected and dramatic results, making for some really visually stunning combinations. So today I want to jump over to the internet and I want to show you what I think are the best Axanthic combinations. Alright, so I'm going to jump over here on Morphmarket.com and I want to start with a normal ball python, just a normal classic wild type ball python, and that is what this is right here. It has pretty much the look of a normal, and they kind of have this yellowish gold color. Normals can vary a little bit, but I'd say in most cases a normal pretty much looks like this. And here's what happens if you actually add Axanthic to a normal, and look at the transformation. That is pretty amazing. Essentially what it does is it strips away all the color and you're left with this really impressive, kind of a silver colored snake. And Axanthics can really vary. Sometimes I've seen them a little bit browned out. Sometimes they can be kind of between an Axanthic and a normal. Really depends on the kind of the line of Axanthic and the specific version of the Axanthic. Speaking of lines of Axanthic, as a matter of fact, there are different lines like the TSK Axanthic and the VPI and the MJ, and they're all, as far as I know, all the different Axanthics are not compatible. So if you took a VPI Axanthic and you bred it to a TSK Axanthic, even though they're both visual Axanthics, they're not compatible. So if you bred them together, you'd get normal looking snakes that are double het for each line of Axanthic. And kind of the complicated part of that is if you took like the double hets and you bred them back together, you would produce Axanthics, but a lot of times you don't know which line they would come from, especially if you start with 2 different lines of the same snake that kind of look visually the same in different lines, so it can be, you know, a little bit confusing. So if you're going into the Axanthic project, I would probably stick with one specific line of Axanthic and not really mix the different lines together. So here I kind of wanted to show you some of the amazing things you can do with Axanthic. It is a pretty powerful gene, and here is something you can mix in the Axanthic that has some pretty dramatic results. This is actually a Firefly, which is a combination of the fire and the pastel gene, and the pastel brings a lot of yellow out, and the fire really intensifies the yellow and really cleans up the background. You get a really bright and flashy snake. And if you actually take the Firefly and you mix it into the Axanthic, take a look at this. This has like the complete opposite effect when you mix it in with Axanthic. Essentially what it does is it really brightens the white in the snake between the fire and the pastel, and especially if you mix those 2 together in Axanthic, you can make any combination really stark and high contrast. So if you actually have an Axanthic combination and you really want to brighten it and enhance it as far as, you know, the black and white contrast, you can add the combination of fire and pastel. As a matter of fact, you can add one or the other. Usually the pastel will really brighten up the background, and then the fire really cleans it up. And you add both of them together and you get a really stunning combination. This is pretty amazing. As a matter of fact, I was actually looking over here. This is probably the closest I've ever seen to the Stormtrooper. If you know what the Stormtrooper is, it's a really famous black and white snake. Almost looks exactly like this one. Pretty amazing. So here is the Pied. The Pied is also a recessive mutation. So if you actually work Axanthic into Pied, it's a little bit more difficult because you're breeding Axanthic to a Pied and you're getting double hets, which is a little challenging. You're getting all normal looking snakes, and essentially what you need to do is you need to breed the double hets back together. And you know, the more hets that you have in there trying to produce a double recessive visual, the lower your odds are. So sometimes this can take a really long time trying to produce a visual. But here's what happens if you actually make an Axanthic Pied. Take a look at this. This is pretty interesting. This is also called the Lightning Pied, and it's kind of interesting. There's not a lot of them that have been produced or that are being produced, and they're really super expensive. I was actually over here on Morphmarket, and this one actually sold for $3,500. Pretty crazy. And there's still, at least, I think the cheapest one I saw over here was like $2,000. Pretty amazing. As a matter of fact, I'm actually working working on a triple recessive project. I produced some triple hets that are albino pied clowns, and I just produced them last year. They're about a year old, probably less than a year, still, you know, not ready to breed. I probably still have at least 2 more years to grow those up. And essentially what I want to do is, if I actually produce a visual that is an albino pied clown, what I want to do is I want to take that triple recessive visual and breed it to an Axanthic female, and that is kind of what I want to go for eventually long term. So really, you know, you kind of have to plan these projects ahead of time. What I really want to do is I want to get an Axanthic female right now, and then kind of plan on breeding my triple visual, if I can ever make one, the triple recessive visual to an Axanthic, and I'll make quadruple hets, which is kind of crazy. And then I can get a lot of these combinations, which would be pretty awesome. So here is the spider ball python. The spider is actually a dominant mutation, and when you mix it with Axanthic, you can produce some really dramatic results. And the spider, essentially what it does is it gives you the spider web pattern right on the top of the snake, and a lot of times it'll bring up a lot of white on the side of the snake, although you can see on this one there's hardly any white at all. I've actually seen spiders with almost 0 white coming up, and some of them have a really strong white about halfway up the snake, looking like a really strong calico, although there's not calico in the spider, it's just part of the gene. And here's what happens if you work spider into the Axanthic. Take a look at this crazy snake. As a matter of fact, I saw this for the first time over on YouTube. Someone said, hey, check out my spider Axanthic, and it didn't even look real. It is so amazing in person. It's hard to tell from these pictures. This almost looks like a cartoon drawing or something. It doesn't even look real. Pretty amazing to see these in person, and it's such a high contrast and such a dramatic combination. As a matter of fact, you can actually take this one step further. I found a spider Axanthic combination with the addition of leopard, and take a look at leopard. Leopard's kind of an interesting gene. It's actually what I consider to be like a pseudo dark gene. You mix it with dark genes, and it really darkens and enhances them. And if you actually take leopard and work it into the Axanthic, it doesn't really darken the gene, but it really kind of jumbles up the pattern. So it's kind of a safe bet working leopard into the Axanthic, because you're not really darkening the background. And here's what happens if you work leopard into the Axanthic spider. Take a look at this crazy snake. That is one of the craziest combinations that I've seen over here on Morphmarket. It is like electrified. I just couldn't even believe this. As a matter of fact, I was wondering how much this one sold for. This one was $1,000 back in 2019, so it hasn't been that long. And this is kind of one of the new ones. Every time I look over here, I see new stuff that I've never seen before. I couldn't believe the Leopard Spider Axanthic. Pretty amazing combination. Alright, so here is the albino ball python. The albino is another recessive. Talk about another difficult project. If you actually breed the albino to the Axanthic, you end up with double hets, similar to the Axanthic working it into pied. And some of these combinations can be pretty difficult to hit, and the prices are usually pretty high when you're looking to buy some of these double recessive combinations. And the albino is usually a really visually dominant gene. A lot of times you'll end up with an albino looking snake that has kind of a jumbled up pattern, but in this case, when you mix albino with the Axanthic, take a look at this. You actually end up with an all-white snake with bright red eyes. Pretty amazing combination. And kind of the challenging thing with some of these white snakes is they pretty much mask all the other genes in the combinations. And I was trying to wrap my head around, all right, if I actually make my triple recessive visual, what do I want to breed that to actually make the quadruple recessive project that I'm actually going to work on? And the problem is if I work Axanthic into it and start working on a quadruple het project, which is, you know, kind of complicated, especially when you mix the Axanthic with the albino, it's going to mask the clown and the pied. So essentially I could get like a snow, which is the combination of the Axanthic and the albino, and I could also have a visual clown and a visual pied in the same snake, and I wouldn't actually know if I hit get all 4 genes, which is kind of problematic when it comes to, you know, working that into my project. As a matter of fact, I could probably breed it to this, make some quadruple heads for Axanthic, and then I could do like something else and make quadruple heads for something else, like maybe sunset or something like that. Would be pretty cool. But there's a lot of possibilities you could do once you actually get into some of these recessives. You know, pretty much the sky is the limit. So here is the Enchi, and if you're actually thinking about doing simpler genes into the Axanthic, Enchi is one of the probably the best ones that work really well with it. And the Enchi, essentially what it does is it really reduces the pattern, kind of reduces it. And a lot of times the Enchi will bring out a lot of yellows and oranges and a lot of combinations. Of course, when you're working on the Axanthic side, it pretty much wipes out all the yellows and oranges. And here's what happens if you work Enchi into the Axanthic. Take a look at this. This is pretty dramatic for just one gene in the Axanthic. Really reduces it, and you get a pretty high contrast, and you can see a little bit of, it's almost like, you know, kind of like a dirty snake. You see a little bit of kind of pixelation on the whites, and to get rid of that pixelation, you can work in the pastel and the fire and make this thing really super high contrast and super clean. I think the fire and the pastel is really the key to making some really dramatic visual effects. And here's the last one I want to show you. This one's kind of interesting. This is the Pinstripe, one of my favorite genes. It's a bright gold snake as a standalone morph, but if you mix it with Axanthic, it's not bright gold. But if you actually mix it in with Axanthic, you lose pretty much all the gold, but you keep the same pattern, which is a really strong stripe right down the top, and kind of this little pinstripes right down the side. And here's what happens if you work Pinstripe into Axanthic. Take a look at this. You get an Axanthic Pinstripe. Pretty amazing combination. It looks almost exactly like a pinstripe, almost like a cartoon drawing of a pinstripe. Pretty amazing combination. All right, so it is time for the question of the day. And Thomas Miller asks, how many allelic complexes can you have in one ball python? And that is a very good question. So essentially you can have an unlimited number of allelic complexes in one ball python, and it gets a little bit complicated with the genetics. So an allelic complex is actually 2 different genes that act like a super. So for example, if you had a snake that was a super pastel, everything you breed it to gets 1 copy of the pastel, and they would all be pastels. All the offspring would carry 1 copy of the pastel. And with an allelic complex, it acts the same, although you have 2 different genes. So example, this snake around my neck here, this is a bamboo. This is Bobby, my bamboo ball python, and this is actually allelic with lesser. So if you actually had a lesser bamboo, you could breed it to something else and it acts like a super, where half the offspring come out as bamboo, half come out as lesser. And then if you had something that was not allelic, like the bamboo and the pastel, so if you actually had a bamboo pastel and you bred it to something else, you would get bamboos, you would get pastels, you would get pastel bamboos. You could reproduce the parent, which you can't do with an allelic complex, and you would also get normals without either pastel or bamboo. And that's the power of an allelic combination. You actually have 2 different genes, and you breed it to something else, you get no normals, which is pretty awesome. So for example, you can actually have a bamboo lesser and a vanilla fire in the same snake. So it would be a bamboo lesser, vanilla cream. Both of those are actually allelic complexes. So you get no normals and you get a whole mix, and all the offspring would either have bamboo and lesser, and on the other half you'd actually get the vanilla or the fire. It gets a little bit complicated when you're actually working with allelic complexes, but as long as you keep, you know, just 2 genes that are compatible in any one complex, you can pretty much have an unlimited number of allelic complexes. So that is pretty much it. Thanks for watching, and I will see you in the next video.